In addition to IMF conditionality, the other major aspect of the IMF that's really important to understand is weighted voting and how it works. So let's talk about that. The IMF is set up in this way. There's a board of directors that is composed of representatives of each country, right? So this board of directors only meets once a year. Usually it's in September or October. Now there are joint meetings with the World Bank Group, and usually these meetings are held in Washington, D.C. in September or October. So, by the way, that's usually a very busy time in Washington, D.C. Hard to get a hotel room during those days because those are the days of the joint annual meeting of the board of directors of the IMF and the World Bank Group. This board of directors, also called board of governors of the IMF, um, it only meets once a year, and it's usually the finance minister, the senior finance minister, uh, or other economic official of the country that is a member of the IMF that attends these meetings. And remember, I mean, almost every country in the world is a member of the IMF, almost about 190 members now, approximately. Um, and all of these senior financial officials that attend these annual conferences, they tend to also share the liberal views of the IMF. They tend to be believers in free markets, minimal government intervention, stable exchange rate as the best outcome for the global economy. So they tend to have those kinds of worldviews. But what really matters isn't the annual meeting of the Board of Governors. What really matters in the IMF is the executive board. And this is the part of the IMF that really runs the day to day operations of the organization. There are 24 members on the executive board. 5 of them are called appointed members. That means that 5 countries have the right always to appoint someone. They always will have someone representing their country's interest on that 24-member executive board. And if you notice, these are the countries that have the most voting power in the IMF. They have also contributed the most money to the IMF. And so in a way, I mean, this is sort of how the IMF is set up. This is the rules of the way the IMF operates, that the countries that contribute the most money, that happens to be these 5 countries, they will be the appointed members of the IMF, and they will always have someone representing their interests, and that is the United States, UK, Germany, France, and Japan. For short, we call this group of 5 countries, we sometimes call them the G5. And so the G5 countries, this is very significant, have veto power. I'll explain that on major decisions of the IMF. So I'll explain that in a little bit more detail in a moment. The other 19 members on the executive board are the so-called elected members. And they're called that because these are much smaller countries with smaller economies. They have much less voting power in the IMF. And so what they do is they'll group themselves together, right, as a voting bloc. And so usually these groups of countries group themselves together because they happen to be in geographic proximity to one another, or they share a common language, or there's some other common thing that brings these coalition or grouping of countries together. And so this group of countries will cast its votes. There will be one representative that they will elect for a 2-year period. These executive board members serve 2-year periods. And that group of countries will elect someone to represent their interests, cast votes on behalf of the entire group of countries for that 2-year period. And so that's why these countries are called, these members are called the elected members. The appointed members, those the G5 countries, they do appoint people to serve their country's interests and to promote, to represent their country on the executive board. They also serve 2-year periods, but again, when that 2-year period is up, the President of the United States, the Prime Minister of UK, the Chancellor of Germany can appoint another member of the executive board. So these 5 countries always have someone represented. If you happen to be Belgium or something, a small country, you may not have someone from your country representing your country on the executive board, but you'll be a part of a group of countries that will have elected someone for a 2-year period. And sometimes those are rotating positions, what have you, but that's how it works. Now, Of these 24 members, um, what is very interesting to notice, and this is the most significant aspect of this of all, is that there is weighted voting. When it comes to decisions about which countries should receive financial assistance, should there be a change in the rules of the IMF, who will be the next managing director of the IMF, the executive board decides these things. But they decide these things using this process of weighted voting. So, what that means is on simple decisions like should a country receive financial assistance in a balance of payments crisis, that's a very technical, simple decision that requires all the votes on the executive board, right? Each country that's a member of the IMF has a voting power based on the size of its GDP. The G5 members that I mentioned have more voting power than anyone else. They have over 30% of the votes on the executive board, in fact. And so, what is interesting is for simple voting decisions, those are decided on a simple 50% plus one weighted voting decision on the executive board. It's a simple majority. But for really important decisions, right? Who will the next managing director of the IMF be? Well, that requires 70% of the votes on the executive board. And if you see what that means, because the G5 countries alone have more than 30% of the voting power on the executive board, if they don't like the, Brazil appoints its finance minister to be the next managing director of the IMF, they put him forward. Every member of the IMF votes in favor of that person to be the next managing director of the IMF, but the G5 say, we don't like that person. They can block it. They can veto that. They can prevent that from happening. And so that is why, if you notice, on these kinds of important decisions, voting on the next managing director of the IMF, etc., that is decided by the executive board and requires 70% votes. Okay, other examples of these kinds of decisions. Hey, maybe it's time to increase the voting power of a country. Its GDP has grown. Shouldn't its voting power grow proportional to its GDP? That's what the rules of the IMF say. Well, guess what? The G5 vote on that, right? So the G5, by the way, why doesn't China have as much voting power in the IMF as other countries that have smaller GDPs? Why is China's voting power much smaller? Well, guess what? This voting power is decided every 5 years. They reassess the size of a country's GDP, to what extent it's grown or shrunk, and they will vote on the change in voting power based on that. But that requires 70% of the votes in the executive board. If the G5 don't want to increase a country's voting power, as they didn't want to for many years, they didn't want to increase China's voting power, they will vote no. And China's voting power will not be increased. So do you see, it is in some sense set up in this way where the G5 do have much more power in the organization than any other countries. And if you notice that those G5 countries, all 5 of them are rich capitalist countries. So you see the structuralists are very critical of how voting power works. Now, the embedded liberals in the IMF would say, oh, that's very silly because really, normally when the executive board votes on something, there's a consensus, everyone agrees. It really doesn't even come to a vote. We just kind of informally ask, okay, who's going to vote on what? And so that would be how they look at this. And they would say, by the way, shouldn't countries that have more assets in the IMF have contributed more money for their subscription fees? Shouldn't they have more say in how the IMF operates? And so, yeah, it makes sense that the G5 would have this veto power. So, in other words, the G5 with more than 30% of the voting power can block important decisions that require 70%. The structuralists see that as unfair. The economic nationalists also see that as, favoring the rich, powerful countries, not so good for the poorer countries. But that's the way the IMF works. You can see why the IMF sometimes is susceptible to criticism, that the core rich capitalist countries, the G5, have a lot of influence on it, and they do. What about this 85%? Look at that. That's where the United States alone has veto power. So this is on really important decisions. And let me give you an example of a really important decision. Someone might propose, hey, why don't we change the voting power structure of the IMF? Why don't we make it so that every country gets the same amount of votes? Well, that would be a major change, right? In the IMF's articles of agreement and the bylaws and so on. That is a big decision. Well, that one would require 85% of the votes on the executive board. There's only one country that has enough votes to block that kind of decision on its own, and that's the United States with over 16% of the votes. Do you see that? So you could have every single country on the executive board, every single representative saying, we should change this. But if the United States says, no, we don't agree, it can block that kind of decision, those very important decisions. So, yes, the United States does contribute the most to the IMF. It has the biggest subscription fee, it also has the biggest quota. But at the same time, that also means it has the most voting power in the IMF. So smart economic nationalists from the United States should love this IMF, right? Because that means it gives the United States more influence, more clout in that organization to promote US national interests. Economic nationalists in smaller, poorer countries, however, might really object to this and say, look, the United States can use this to promote its national interests, even if it's harmful to us. So that's why there are some different views on this. And you can imagine, of course, the structuralists have a field day with this. They say, look, the rich capitalist countries, especially the United States, have the most influence in the IMF. And when you look at the IMF conditions, it looks to us, they would argue, that the IMF is just set up, it's just rigged to help the rich capitalist countries get even richer and to help exploit the poor countries even more. So there definitely are different views on this. It's not my position here to argue one way or another. I'm just pointing out this is how it works. This is why the IMF can be controversial. This is why the IMF conditions, when they're imposed, often meet with criticism from people that have to meet these conditions. Hey, these conditions look like they're just benefiting the United States or just benefiting the G5. Now you understand why there are sometimes those arguments. The embedded liberals would respond, but wait a minute, what we're doing is good for all countries. It's a win-win. Yes, it could be it helps the United States and European countries and Japan, but it helps the poor country too get back on its feet and get back on track. So they would look at that from the embedded liberal point of view, but as you can see, there could be other worldviews on this, right? So that's what I wanted to explain about weighted voting.